He didn't lose his power. He wasn't betrayed. No one pushed him out. So why did he choose to remove everyone from his own life? His brothers, his son, one by one. Why would a man at the absolute peak of success decide to cut off his own family? Warner Brothers dominated Hollywood. His name was everywhere in America. No one questioned his authority. So what was still not enough? This house was built to prove that someone had won. But the closer you look, the more it resembles a sentence, carved in stone. Beverly Hills, nearly 10 acres, high fences, locked iron gates. Why does someone who has everything need so many layers of separation from the outside? This is one of the most powerful homes in Hollywood. From the inside, it ends in silence. Why does an industry as loud as Hollywood end in absolute quiet? In his final years, Jack Warner lived here, among antiques, priceless art, and rooms too large to fill. Beside him stood the wife who stayed. But those who carried the Warner name, the ones who were expected to be there, never appeared. Why were there no brothers? Why was there no son? Why did no one come back? Not because of distance, not because of time. So what was cut so deeply that it could never be repaired? This house was once the center of Hollywood power, a place where movie stars, politicians, and media tycoons gathered. But when the lights went out, what remained was not glory. Why does greater power leave behind greater emptiness? This video does not ask what Jack Warner built. It asks, why are some victories only possible by eliminating the people closest to you? And if a family oath is created to protect, why is it always the first thing to be broken? To answer these questions, we have to go backward. Before Hollywood, before money, before fame, back to a poor village in Poland. Why did four brothers who once swore never to turn their backs on each other end in lifelong silence? In Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century, Jewish families did not ask, "What will tomorrow be like?" They asked, "Will tonight be safe?" In regions controlled by the Russian Empire, Jewish communities lived under constant surveillance, legal restrictions, and the threat of sudden violence. You did not need to break the law to lose everything. You only needed to be in the wrong place on the wrong day. In Krasnozielsk, a small town in what is now Poland, Benjamin Warner made a living repairing shoes. It was not a profession that promised a future. It was only enough to survive. Until the family grew larger, and survival itself was no longer guaranteed. In 1889, Benjamin put his family on a ship bound for America. They arrived in Baltimore with little money, little English, and no one waiting for them. America, at that moment, was not a dream. It was a test. Benjamin did everything he could. He repaired shoes. He sold goods door to door. He opened small shops, then closed them. The family moved again and again, until they finally settled in Youngstown, Ohio, a steel town where factories consumed the labor of an entire city. The Warner children grew up surrounded by the sound of machines, the smell of metal, and the exhaustion of a father who refused to give up. And one day, Benjamin gathered his sons. He did not speak about money. He did not speak about America. He spoke about survival. He asked them to promise one thing, that no matter what happened, they would stand together. Because in a world that offered them no real opportunity, family was the only asset they possessed. If that rule was kept, they could go far. If it was broken, everything else would be reduced to numbers on a page. The four sons received that promise in four very different ways. Harry, the eldest, accepted it as a moral obligation. He believed order and principle were what kept people from falling into chaos. Albert saw the promise as a system. Everyone had a role. Every mistake had to be corrected before it spread. Sam saw it as an opportunity. If the family stayed united, they could take risks. With the future. With technology. With ideas no one else believed in. Jack, however, was different. Jack did not see the promise as a boundary. He saw it as a launch point. Something that allowed him to move faster, louder, and farther than anyone else. 4 personalities, 1 promise. A family stepping into the 20th century. None of them knew that this promise would one day become the most repeated line in their story. When it was finally broken. And from here, the story begins to accelerate. Every Hollywood empire likes to say it began with vision. But for the Warners, it began with a bedsheet. In 1903, Sam Warner bought a second-hand film projector and a single reel of film. He hung a bedsheet behind his father's shop, turned off the lights, and pressed play. The audience held their breath. They had never seen moving images tell a story like this before. Each screening cost 5 cents. A small amount, repeated often enough. From that moment, Sam understood something essential. Cinema did not need to be beautiful. It needed to make people come back. In 1905, they opened their first theater in Newcastle. They called it the Cascade. 99 seats. Not for aesthetics, but for the law. 1 more seat would have triggered fire safety regulations they could not afford. 99 seats allowed them to survive in the gray zone of the system. This was when the Warner family learned the most important rule of the entertainment business. The law is not meant to be broken. It is meant to be approached as closely as possible. But a single theater was fragile. If producers cut off the supply of films, everything would end. So they moved into distribution. They bought films. They rented them out. They controlled the flow. Harry controlled the money. Albert controlled the schedule. Sam controlled the machines. Jack controlled the audience. Each had a role. No one was expendable. In 1918, the name Warner Brothers Pictures officially appeared in Hollywood, but to the major studios, they were still outsiders. Low budgets, high risk, failure always close. Then Rin Tin Tin appeared. A dog, rescued from the battlefields of Europe, unexpectedly became a box office star. At a moment when the studio was running out of money, films starring Rin Tin Tin pulled audiences back into theaters. For a brief period, the fate of Warner Brothers was tied to an animal. That success kept them alive, but it did not put them on top. And at that moment, standing at the edge of collapse, a decision was made. A decision that, if wrong, would erase Warner Brothers from history. And if right, Hollywood would never be the same again. But this is where the story turns. Hollywood in the early 1920s was a silent world. Audiences were used to reading words on a screen. Music came from the orchestra pit, not from the film itself. Most studio heads believed that spoken voices would break the magic of cinema. They did not want risk, and they did not need risk. Sam Warner was different. He saw the future in unfinished machines. A system called Vitaphone, which allowed sound to move in sync with images, even if it was imperfect. Other studios laughed. They said audiences did not need to hear actors speak. They said the costs were unacceptable. But Warner Brothers had no safe option. Either they innovated, or they disappeared. Around 1926, they poured their money, their reputation, and their entire future into Vitaphone. The investment was large enough to push the studio toward a liquidity crisis within a short period of time. By 1927, Trade papers began asking whether Warner Brothers would survive to the end of the year, and at that moment, the jazz singer went into production. It was not a fully talking picture, but it was enough to change how audiences experienced cinema. Behind the scenes, Sam rarely left the machine room. He checked every recording, every synchronization. His body began to fail. Severe headaches, dizziness, bleeding. The diagnosis came too late. The infection had spread to his brain. On October 5, 1927, Sam Warner died. The next night, at the premiere, Al Jolson spoke. "You ain't heard nothin' yet." The audience erupted. A new era began. And one man was not there to see it. The man who created the future died just before the future found its voice. Warner Brothers survived. Then it rose. But from that moment on, this family was never the same again. But this is where the story turns. After the success of the jazz singer, Warner Brothers entered a phase that very few studios ever reached. They were no longer challengers. They became one of the studios shaping Hollywood itself. Their theater network expanded across the United States. Smaller studios were acquired one by one. Hit films were released regularly, even as the American economy sank into the Great Depression. But alongside that growth, something essential disappeared. Sam Warner, the third brother, the one who held the family together through technology and compromise, was no longer there to keep the balance. For years, Sam stood between conflicts. He softened the differences between Harry Warner, the eldest brother who believed in principle and social responsibility, and Jack Warner, the youngest, who became increasingly focused on personal power and creative control. When Sam died, no one replaced that role. From Hollywood, Jack controlled production, deciding which films were made, who was cast, and which careers were advanced or ended. From New York, Harry controlled the money, enforced financial discipline, and tried to maintain the moral limits he believed were necessary. Two centers of power. Two ways of seeing the world. The tension simmered for years, until it began to surface in specific stories. One of the most frequently cited stories centers on Casablanca in 1942. The film was produced during World War II, under the direct supervision of Hal Wallis, a veteran Warner Brothers producer responsible for the project from script through post-production. When Casablanca won the Academy Award for Best Picture, Jack Warner, as the studio's head in Hollywood, stepped onto the stage to accept the award. The man behind the entire production, the person primarily responsible for the film, was not on that stage. A few months later, Hal Wallis left Warner Brothers. To many within the industry, this was more than a dispute over credit. It was a sign that power had begun to change how Jack saw the people around him. In his personal life, Jack changed as well. He built his first mansion in Beverly Hills as a personal milestone, a declaration that he had entered the ranks of Hollywood's moguls. But behind those walls was a secret relationship that lasted for years. Ann Page, a young actress, entered Jack's life while he was still married. The relationship remained hidden until it resulted in the birth of a child in 1934. The scandal could not be concealed. The divorce that followed caused a deep rupture within the Warner family. Harry Warner and Albert Warner, the second brother responsible for operations and distribution, refused to recognize Ann. They cut off contact with Jack for an extended period of time. Jack chose a different path. He married Ann, severed ties with the past, and began building a private world where power allowed him to decide who stayed and who was pushed out. There are people who grow richer and grow more desperate to be loved, but the way they demand love is through power. The empire continued to expand. But from this point forward, the Warner family no longer moved in the same direction. This decision changed everything. When paradise is built from loneliness, when Jack Warner decided to build his new home in Beverly Hills, he did not renovate the old one. He demolished it entirely. The house connected to his first marriage disappeared in dust and rubble. Jack did not want to repair the past. He wanted to erase it. Architect Roland Coate, known for designing estates for California's elite, was brought in. The chosen style was Georgian Revival. Symmetrical, severe, restrained, evoking old European authority. The facade did not invite, it stood like a verdict. Inside, the entire interior was entrusted to William Haynes, a former silent film star who had reinvented himself as the most influential interior designer in Hollywood. Haynes filled the mansion with European antiques, towering mirrors, high ceilings, and oversized rooms. These rooms were not designed for living. They were designed to impress. Jack did not stop at a single house. He bought more land. Then more. Neighboring homes were gradually demolished, merged into a single estate spanning nearly 9 acres, a scale almost unimaginable even in Beverly Hills. On this land, Jack built multiple guest houses, each elegant enough to host heads of state, championship-level tennis courts, a vast swimming pool, framed by classical columns, greenhouses, and a private plant nursery, a 9-hole private golf course, allowing him to play without ever leaving the property, and inside the motor court, a private gas station, so the outside world never needed to enter. This was no longer a house. It was a self-contained ecosystem of power. The landscape was entrusted to Florence Yoch, who had designed environments for major Hollywood productions. She transformed the grounds into a stage, paths directing the eye, lawns expanding to display scale, fountains and terraces positioned so that every step led attention back to the owner. By the late 1932, the Warner estate had become an unofficial center of power in Hollywood. Parties were held regularly. A list, actors, major directors, politicians, financial titans. Many described it as Hollywood's Olympus, a place where power was seen, negotiated, and granted. But when the parties ended, the lights dimmed, and guests passed through the gates, the house became unnervingly silent. Dining rooms built for dozens now held a single occupied chair. Long corridors echoed with the footsteps of servants, not family. Jack's son from his first marriage rarely appeared. The relationship existed in name only. Anne was there, but between them stretched a distance filled with things no longer spoken. Jack continued his affairs, barely concealed. The house had enough rooms to hold every secret, but none for genuine intimacy. The more perfect the house became, the less laughter it contained, because it was not built to be lived in. It was built to win. And in that victory, Jack Warner began to enter a kind of loneliness that no party could ever erase. This decision changed everything. There was a time in Hollywood when people were not afraid of box office failure. They were afraid of being named. After World War II, America entered another kind of war. No bombs, no front lines. A war built on fear. Communism was no longer described as something distant. It was framed as a threat already inside the country. And Hollywood, the industry that shaped stories for millions, was suddenly treated as a danger zone. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee began public hearings targeting the film industry. No criminal evidence was required. No verdict was necessary. Only a question. Have you ever been a member? Do you know anyone who is? Inside that room, silence itself became an answer. Those who were summoned understood exactly what was at stake. Refuse to answer, and you could lose your freedom. Answer, and you could lose your friends. Be named, and your career could end permanently. This was not an investigation of individuals. It was a collective test of loyalty. And now, Hollywood's most powerful figures had to choose: stand with the people who had built their studios, or stand with political power. Under the glare of congressional lights, Jack Warner appeared before the committee as a friendly witness, not as an accused man, but as a cooperating one. He was not forced to testify. He chose to. Jack stated that Warner Brothers did not tolerate communist ideology. He argued that terminating contracts with suspected individuals was necessary to protect the nation. In that room, every word he spoke carried more weight than an accusation, because he was not just a witness. He was a center of power. What followed was never signed, never officially announced, yet universally understood. Writers who had worked for years suddenly stopped receiving calls. Directors once trusted with major projects were quietly labeled unfit. There were no formal notices, no written bans, only coordinated silence. The blacklist did not exist on paper. It existed in broken phone calls, in vague refusals, in eyes that would not meet. Hundreds of careers were frozen. Many never returned to Hollywood at all. And what made this period a tragedy was not that Jack Warner acted alone. It was that everyone believed they had no other choice. The system ran on fear, and those with power kept it running by sacrificing others. Jack Warner kept his studio, kept his position, kept his authority. But from that moment on, he chose power over loyalty. And that choice did not only fracture trust within the industry, it shattered the first promise his father had demanded of his sons. When they boarded a ship bound for America, in this new world, family was no longer the only asset. Power was, and it had to be protected at any cost. And this was still not the final betrayal. But this is where the story truly turns. By the mid-1950s, Warner Brothers was no longer a studio built by immigrants struggling to survive. It had become a major corporation, under pressure from television, capital markets, and an aging leadership. The three surviving brothers were all in their 60s. Harry Warner, the eldest, was exhausted after decades of conflict with Jack. Albert Warner, who had long handled operations behind the scenes, had largely withdrawn from daily company life. And Jack Warner, the youngest, still controlled production in Hollywood. In 1956, a proposal emerged. A group of investors approached Warner Brothers with an offer to buy the family's shares. For Harry and Albert, the timing felt right. Not to leave in defeat, but with dignity. The three brothers reached what seemed like a symbolic agreement. They would sell their shares, and they would leave the company together. This was not just a business transaction. It was the last way to honor a promise made to their late father. But while the paperwork moved forward under that assumption, Jack Warner began a parallel process. He quietly negotiated with the buyers, not to step away, but to return with absolute control. The mechanism was simple. The consequences were not. Jack sold his shares alongside his brothers, then used the very proceeds of that sale to buy back control and retain his leadership position. When the deal was completed, Harry and Albert learned the truth through the press. They were gone. Jack remained. There was no family meeting, no direct explanation, only an irreversible reality. Jack Warner had pushed his own brothers out of the company they had built together. Harry's reaction was collapse. He was deeply shaken, both physically and emotionally. Those close to him later said he never forgave Jack. The two brothers never spoke again for the rest of Harry's life. Albert also cut off all contact. The second brother, who had spent his life avoiding confrontation, considered this the final line. Their father's oath that the family must stand together in a world that offered them no mercy was torn apart. Jack Warner became the sole winner. He held power. He stayed in Hollywood. He controlled the legacy bearing the Warner name. But from that moment on, he also signed himself into another sentence, the sentence of absolute solitude. This decision changed everything. In 1958, on a road in France, the car carrying Jack Warner was involved in a serious accident. The man who once controlled Hollywood fell unconscious. For days, no one knew whether he would wake up. The news brought the family together. Jack's son flew to France in silence. There are moments when people believe that when faced with death, a person will soften. But inside that hospital room, the seed of a new conflict began to grow. While Jack lay in a coma, his son spoke about the future of the business, about responsibility if the worst were to happen. Those words, in Ann Warner's ears, no longer sounded like responsibility. They sounded like a step taken too early. Tension flared between Ann and Jack's son, not through raised voices, but through glances and distance. When Jack woke up, he was told what had been said, and his reaction did not carry the weight of a man who had just escaped death. It carried the weight of power being threatened. Jack exploded in anger. No questions. No conversation. He fired his son from Warner Brothers. The order was immediate. Security was mobilized. Doors were closed. The son was blocked from the very world he believed he belonged to. From that moment on, the father and son relationship no longer existed as it once had. Jack Warner survived, but instead of reconciliation, he chose to end it. Some people soften after surviving death. Jack used that survival to sever the final thread. Family was no longer a place to return to. Only power remained, and a man standing alone behind it. But this is where the story becomes irreversible. After the accident in 1958, Jack Warner survived, but from that moment on, he no longer controlled the world the way he once had. Hollywood was changing its rhythm. Television was exploding. Audiences were leaving theaters. Studios were forced to merge, restructure, and rely on outside capital. The era of the individual studio king was coming to an end. Jack Warner still sat in his familiar office in Burbank, but the most important decisions were no longer entirely his to make. In 1966, control of Warner Brothers officially slipped from Jack Warner's hands, not to another family, not to a successor he had chosen, but to Seven Arts Productions, a financial conglomerate with no roots in Hollywood, no shared memory, no inherited promise, and no obligation to the Warner family. Jack was no longer king. He became a chairman, in name only, and was soon pushed aside by the new power structure. The company that bore his name was now run by people who did not need his permission and did not need history's approval. The Warner Brothers dynasty ended here. Not with a collapse, but with a transaction. Jack Warner remained wealthy. He continued to live in his vast Beverly Hills estate, surrounded by art, land, and reputation. But he no longer held power, and more importantly, he no longer had anyone. No brothers, no son, no successor. The estate once built as a stage for victory slowly turned inward. No more grand parties, no more conversations, only long corridors and carefully preserved silence. In 1978, Jack Warner died. The man who once controlled Hollywood ended his life inside the very house built to prove that he had won everything. But that victory had no witnesses. After Jack, Ann Warner remained in the estate. Over time, she withdrew completely from public life. The gates closed. The gatherings disappeared. The house became a living museum of Hollywood's golden age. Everything was preserved. But life itself was no longer invited inside. Ann Warner died in 1990. The estate still stands. The gardens are still trimmed. The statues remain upright. But the people who created the story never returned. Jack Warner built this house to defeat time. But time did not take the house. Time only took the people who might have sat down and spoken with him. You can buy more land, more statues, more art, but you cannot buy back a family you chose to remove with your own hands. The house no longer belongs to the Warner family, but the Warner story never left its walls. In 1990, for the first time in more than half a century, the Warner estate was placed on the market. The buyer was David Geffen, a name not born of classical Hollywood, but one that represented a new kind of power. In the American entertainment industry, Geffen did not build his empire with movie lots. He built it with music, intellectual property, and contracts. A generation of moguls who did not need to appear on screen, yet controlled everything behind it. The price was $47.5 million, a figure that made all of Los Angeles stop and stare in 1990. Geffen did not enter the house as a resident. He entered it as a successor of an era. He did not inherit history. He bought it. Tens of millions of dollars were poured into renovations, new security systems, redesigned landscapes. Everything became more perfect, cleaner, safer. But one thing did not change: the silence. 30 years passed. Hollywood continued to change hands. Power continued to migrate. And then, in 2020, another name appeared: Jeff Bezos. Not a man of Hollywood, not a man of entertainment, but the embodiment of 21st century power. Data, infrastructure, invisible control. Bezos paid $165 million for the Warner estate, setting a new record for residential real estate in California. If Jack Warner used this house to defeat his own brothers, if David Geffen used it to assert post-Hollywood power, then Jeff Bezos used it to declare that he stood above all those eras. Every century creates its own kind of power, and power always seeks to freeze itself into stone, columns, gardens, and iron gates. But some things do not disappear when ownership changes. Hallways that once absorbed the silence after betrayal. Gardens where no one remained to speak. Walls that have taken in too much ambition and far too little forgiveness. The Warner estate is preserved perfectly, but perfect does not mean harmless. History can be bought back, symbols can be acquired, even legacy can be purchased, but history does not always agree to remain silent. And the real question is not who owns this house now. It is who will be the next person forced to live with what it has already witnessed. This story is not about a house. It is about a choice, a vow born out of poverty and fear, then slowly distorted when power entered the room. Jack Warner did not fail. He won too much, and those victories, one by one, cost him his brothers, his children, and his final connection to other people. The house he built still stands. Bigger, more valuable, passed on to men with even greater power. But each time ownership changed, the story inside never did. Success without love is an empty room. Power without conscience is something that slowly consumes itself. Some legacies are not measured by what is left behind, but by who no longer wants to come back. And some victories are only fully visible when no one is left standing beside you to witness them. If one day you achieve everything you ever wanted, but lose your family and the relationships that mattered most, would you call that a victory? If you want to keep exploring stories where brilliance hides very real costs, the videos now on your screen will take you further down that path. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. We will meet again in the stories to come.